In order to find the real revolution, we have to start with, where the real story starts, not in the Boston Harbor or at Lexington, but a decade earlier in the smoking aftermath of a different war, a war that most Americans don't really remember, but one that Britain never forgot. Because Britain actually won that war, and winning it is what eventually cost them America. So let's go back to February 1763. The Treaty of Paris is signed, and Great Britain just won the largest war that the world had ever seen. We call our corner of it the French and Indian War, but it was really a world war, fought across North America, Europe, the Caribbean, India, the open ocean, and Britain didn't just win, they dominated. They kicked France basically out of Canada and claimed everything east of the Mississippi, and there was just one problem with conquering half the planet, and that's the bill. The war had nearly doubled Britain's national debt. It was roughly like 75 million pounds in 1756 to 133 million in 1763. That is like less than 10 years that they doubled their debt. And the interest payments alone were eating more than half of the entire national budget. I mean, think about that, right? Like, that's insane. I mean, war is costly and someone has to pay for it. So you can do all the conquest you want, but eventually you're going to put yourself into economic ruin. So before Britain could pay for a single soldier or a ship or anything at all, not even like a biscuit or a McVitie's hobnob, half of every pound the government collected was gone, just like that. And servicing the debt from a war that they had actually won, like that's where the money was going to an already achieved battle. And a huge chunk of that war had been fought to protect the American colonies. On top of that, Britain was now keeping around like 10,000 soldiers stationed in America, and that cost was not nothing. That was roughly like 200,000 pounds a year, guarding a frontier that had just exploded into violence with Pontiac's Rebellion, this massive Native American uprising in the Ohio country. So from London's point of view, and from the perspective of the king, the math was pretty simple. Hey, we just spent a fortune defending you from all these people that were trying to take you or take your land or kill you, and we're still spending a fortune protecting you to this day because the Native Americans are pissed and everyone around you is trying to get a peace. So now it's time that the colonies chip in. Now, here's where we hit the first myth. What we're taught is this: Britain were crushing the colonies under the weight of these unbearable taxes, squeezing these helpless colonists that were just there for a new life, and they had no choice but to revolt. But the records actually show something a little different. The American colonists were just about the least taxed people in the entire British Empire. And it's really not even close. In Britain itself, the average person paid around 26 shillings a year in taxes. So that's taxes on land, on houses, windows, carriages, newspaper, beer, literally everything the actual British citizens were, paying taxes on. In the American colonies, the per capita figure has been estimated to about 1 shilling a year, which is a little bit less. I mean, they're still getting taxed without being represented, but it's not exactly what I heard when I was in school. So by 1775, the British government was consuming about a fifth of its own citizens' income. Again, trying to pay off this costly war, while New Englanders were paying somewhere between 1 and 2% of their income. So when the Stamp Act arrived in 1765, this is a tax on legal documents and newspapers and playing cards, anything that would kind of have a stamp on it. Colonists weren't being bled dry in the way that we're kind of led to believe. What actually enraged them was the precedent. And I think this is an important thing to think about when it comes to American history, because Americans are very concerned about the precedent of everything. This one thing isn't so bad, but what is it going to lead to? What is the slippery slope? And it starts really right here. Because up until that point, internal taxes had been the business of these colonial assemblies. But what I mean by that is Americans were taxing Americans through legislatures they actually elected. There weren't any of their own representatives in the British Parliament. And plus, Parliament is demanding a shilling today. But tomorrow, who knows? It could be 10 shillings. It could be 100 shillings. They could just bleed us dry. And that's what the no taxation without representation really meant. It's was London being super unfair? Maybe not. But could they be? Sure. And that's why we got to push back. That's the colonial mindset. But that's still not the entire story. Because for some of the most powerful men in America, there were other grievances, and that's land. That same year, 1763, King George III drew a line down the map of North America, right along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and declared everything west of it off limits to any type of colonial settlement. And it was called the Proclamation of 1763. So, to the, monarchists in London, that was damage control. Pontiac's rebellion that I just mentioned earlier was burning through the frontier, and keeping settlers and native nations apart was actually a lot cheaper than any other type of like skirmish or just a full-on other war. So they were like, hey, you can't go that way because it's going to be expensive for us to come in and clean up the mess. So you guys got to stay right here. But to a very specific class of very wealthy people, that line was a financial catastrophe. You see, the upper class of Virginia had actually been speculating in Western land for years. Since the 1740s, they had literally millions of acres that they had granted to firms for future sales. So the proclamation's new restrictions kept all of these land speculators and investors from gaining the titles that they needed to secure their claims. So this new proclamation was basically messing up their money. And one of the men that was hit the hardest was a tall Virginia planter and a veteran surveyor named George Washington. Yes, George Washington is many things: a brave man, a great general, but also was a very prominent and very wealthy land speculator. Washington had dedicated a lot of his life to this exact pursuit. He chased economic independence and status amongst Virginia's elite. And again, this is not a knock on George Washington. I'm just saying the version that we get on the dollar bill is like, oh, this guy is the perfect man. He's basically Jesus. Well, the reality is all people, specifically people in history, they have kind of, mixed elements of their life. He fought in the French and Indian War, partly on the promise of 200,000 acres of Western land for Virginia's soldiers. And in 1763, he helped found the Mississippi Land Company, his most ambitious Western land scheme ever. And it was launched mere weeks before the proclamation slammed the door shut. So the bigger picture is that the revolution's leadership wasn't just fighting for principles. Some of them, perhaps George Washington himself, had investments also riding on this independence, which brings us to the tea. Again, here's what we're taught and what I talked about earlier. Britain taxed tea so brutally that the furious colonists just said, you know what, F you. They dumped it into the harbor rather than, pay the tax. But what the records actually show is that the Tea Act of 1773 in some ways made tea cheaper. Wildly enough, the East India Company, Britain's mega corporation, basically like the OG, Amazon of the day, they were drowning in debt with warehouses full of unsold tea. So Parliament passed the Tea Act in May of 1773 as a corporate bailout. It gave the East India Company a tax break that actually made its tea cheaper than the tea being smuggled into the colonies. Because that's the other thing that you may have not heard in history class. America ran on smuggled tea. At this point in history, roughly 86% of all the tea that the colonies were getting was smuggled Dutch tea. We're talking almost 1 million pounds of tea was coming in illegally every single year. So when those East India Company ships were sailing into Boston Harbor, cheap legal tea wasn't a relief. It was a threat to the smugglers and to the merchants who built fortunes smuggling in tea on the black market. Does that make sense? If they're bringing in the legit tea, but then the smuggled tea is a little bit cheaper, it's let's just go with the smuggled tea and forget the East India Company. And some of the merchants that were doing the smuggling would end up funding the resistance. Obviously for financial reasons, hey, let's get rid of this tea because we're making all of our bread on this tea. The company that we own, the illegal smuggling enterprise that we actually get a piece of. And to the principled side of the movement, cheap tea was something even worse. It was like a trap. You see, if you buy the discounted tea and pay the small duty that's attached to it, even though the tea is technically cheaper and the duty is so minuscule, you've basically acquiesced to Parliament's right to tax you at all, which goes back again to that Stamp Act thing. It's hey, the precedent. We don't care that the tax is actually basically nothing or that the tax makes it cheaper. You're taxing us without letting us vote, and that we can't stand for. So on the night of December 16th, 1773, when a bunch of dudes dressed as Mohawks dumped 342 chests of East India Company tea into Boston Harbor, they weren't just, protesting against tea. They definitely weren't protesting against expensive tea. They were destroying the cheap tea that threatened their illegal business maneuvers. Now, quick review, because we've covered a lot so far. Here's where we stand. The colonists were the least taxed people in the empire. fighting over principle rather than like actual financial oppression. Their wealthiest leaders had a ton of land and land speculation that was behind a line that the king told them not to cross. So that also messed up their money. And the most famous protest in American history, the one that we hear about all the time, Boston Tea Party, was aimed at a price cut because it threatened the business of those running basically like a tea mafia. Now, none of that makes the American revolutionary cause like fake. It's not like, oh, this is BS. Like it was all, we've been lied to. It's just not the complete truth. The self-government argument was real, and people genuinely believed that they deserve the right to govern themselves. But it does mean that the question of why America revolted a lot more interesting and a lot more complicated than just like, tyranny. And that mess is about to get a lot bigger because America didn't actually agree on any of this. That's the part that I find most interesting. When the fighting actually started, thousands of Americans looked at the patriot revolutionary cause, and instead they were like, hey, we're just going to stick with the king. In some colonies, the fighting actually was less like a revolution and it was more like a civil war. Now, this is actually something that I did hear when I did a tour of Boston when I was like, I don't know, like the end of college, that basically at the time you had 1/3 loyalists that were loyal to the king. You had another third that were the patriots, that were the rebels in America that wanted to shrug off the tyranny. And then you had another third that was kind of like in the middle. They were a little bit neutral. They didn't really know what was going on. And it's in textbooks and documentaries and even the tours that I took. And it's usually credited to one man, and that's John Adams. But right off the bat, there's a couple problems with this famous statistic. First, Adams wasn't taking a poll in 1776. The quote comes from a letter that he wrote in 1815. That's 40 years after independence, when he was living on and writing from his farm. And second, when historians actually look at the numbers, the picture of like this whole 1/3 divide is actually a lot less even. A landmark 1968 study put loyalists at about 16% of the population. Nearly 1 in 5 free citizens were actually riding with the king. And historian Robert Calhoun found that active patriot support topped out around like 40 to 45% of the free population. His words said, at most, no more than a bare majority. What's interesting here is that the revolution was actively supported by barely half the people it claimed to speak for. Everyone else was either against it or just like keeping their heads down and just kind of focusing on their everyday life and hope that the armies just left them alone. And again, here's what we're taught, that these 13 colonies united against a common enemy and they fought the king very bravely, yada, yada, yada. But again, the record shows something a little bit more interesting, that the population is basically split down the middle and at many turns was actually fighting themselves. So by 1783, around 19,000 Americans had enlisted in the British Army, with thousands more in the Loyalist militias. That is the mini American armies in favor of Great Britain. And when it all ended, roughly 80,000 people fled the country. It's really interesting. It's actually one of the largest refugee crises in early American history, and we never talk about it. The people that left America after the war was done because, they were afraid for themselves, they were afraid for the nation that they lived in, and they just decided to flee. And those who stayed behind, the war between neighbors went on. Long before Lexington, patriot crowds were enforcing loyalty with tarring and feathering. You basically take a dude, you strip him naked, you pour like boiling hot pine tar all over his skin, and you coat him in feathers and then parade him through the town. Like the way I remember it in class, I was like, oh, that's kind of funny. I thought it was like a prank. It sounded like fraternity hazing. Kind of torture. If you take a step back, you're like, oh, they were just torturing dudes, basically. And it was designed to terrify anyone that was leaning toward the king and the cause of London. And it worked really well. It worked so well, actually, that countless loyalists signed patriot oaths under this threat, or they just went silent and just never said another word, which means even our best statistics still undercount them. Let that be shown